Uh, Hello, good morning, everyone. So today we have, it's a pleasure to introduce Piyush Sharda. I said it correctly. So I'm sure that he's going to give a very, very interesting talk. So he did a PhD with Krumholtz in Australia and finished like half a year ago or so, last year or something like that. And so, I mean, he's he has been studying with a reference on the IMF and this kind of thing, star formation from the very basic thing. And I think he's going to talk about this. Now he's in Leiden. He's visiting us on vacation, but somehow he make a break to work a bit. And in Leiden, he's a postdoc with one of these prestigious grants, the Oort Fellow. So, I don't going to take your time and go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to Jorge for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that my collaborators and I have been doing the last few years. With the central theme of looking at metals, and by metals I mean gas phase metallicity, oxygen abundances in particular, and trying to understand the role of metals in star formation as well as galaxy evolution, so on. So one of the reasons why we care about metals so much in the context of galaxy evolution is that these are often like tracers of galaxy evolution. We can observe them. We can observe them through their emission lines, absorption lines, and so on. And that really helps us put together a picture of galaxy assembly and evolution. So to drive this point home, I'm just showing a movie of a large, fairly massive galaxy that starts to form at high redshifts. This is from the illustrious TNG simulations. And the different panels here show you the evolution in different quantities that we really care about when we talk about galaxy evolution. So the stellar mass over here, the gas temperature, gas pressure, cooling, entropy, and so on. But if you focus on this panel over here, which is the gas phase metallicity, you'll see that whatever is happening in the other panels, if you, for example, have minor mergers or outflows, or in fact a major merger here, for example, that's very nicely mirrored in the metallicity map. So often, not all of these quantities are directly accessible to us in observations. Metallicity is. So we can use metallicity as a proxy of all of these different processes that shape up galaxies over cosmic time. But at the very heart of this entire talk about metals is how actually are metals produced. Our current understanding says all of the metals we see, except for hydrogen, helium, maybe a little bit of lithium, is produced in stars. So then the fundamental question becomes, how do stars form, or when do stars really form? If you go back to your undergrad, master's level courses in astronomy, introduction to astronomy, you always think, oh, you have known about this for a while now, where people say, okay, stars are forming when molecular clouds are collapsing. These clouds are fairly cold, like 10 kelvins or so on. They collapse, the density increases, and then they form stars. The fundamental thing that is needed for star formation is we need to have some mass of gas, and the mass of the gas needs to overcome this very critical mass that we call the Jeans mass, because that sort of dictates the role of gravity. Ultimately, stars are forming, clouds are collapsing due to gravity. So understanding how much mass you need to actually form a star depends on this Jeans mass. And in its simplest form, it's dependent on temperature and density. That's all you need to know from this slide. So if you understand the evolution of temperature and density in molecular clouds, you will then have an idea of how stars are forming and what are the sort of stars that will form in molecular clouds. But there is a huge dynamic range of ISM physics involved between the time when a molecular cloud starts collapsing to when it actually forms stars. And all of this ISM physics is then dictated by these 5 key things. We have chemistry, which sets the thermodynamics, for example. We have turbulence, because these are not stationary systems. Molecular clouds are very dynamic. any system where gravity or where density and velocities are changing, you will inherently have some turbulence. We also have feedback from stars that have already formed. So if the because molecular clouds are not collapsing at the same time, different parts of molecular clouds collapse at different times. If some part has collapsed first, it has produced some stars already. These stars will start to produce a lot of photons, ionize the gas around them, and then impact the formation of further stars that would come up later in the same cloud. And magnetic fields, which are of course very important for us to understand how accretion happens onto stars, how protostellar outflows occur, and so on. So all of these processes then conspire together to yield the number and the mass of stars we are forming. And that is what is now known as the initial mass function or the mass distribution of stars, the IMF. Now, so this, if you've heard of the Kennicut-Schmidt relation, Rob Kennicut, back in 1998, when that famous seminal paper came out, he also said the exact this thing. The accurate knowledge of the form and mass limits of the IMF and its variation in different environments is critical to virtually every aspect of star formation, stellar populations, and galaxy evolution. So IMF remains a very fundamental quantity for us to understand when we talk about any of these three topics. And it still remains fairly elusive, very tricky, both from a simulations theory or an observations point of view, to really understand what gives rise to a mass distribution of stars in a given environment. So let's see what we actually know about the IMF. Even now, there's only one place where we have mapped the entire IMF. And when I say that, I mean we have gone to a particular star cluster or molecular cloud. We have counted all the stars. We have estimated their masses, and then we have created a PDF or a probability density distribution. We have only been able to do this very well in the solar neighborhood. So within plus minus 3 kiloparsecs from the sun, really. And this is how it looks like. So the y-axis here is the number of stars in logarithmic mass bins. And there is some historical reasons for why we plot dn over d log m as a function of the stellar mass. And you see that this is the IMF in the solar neighborhood, which is at birth, which means these are the masses of the stars when they're actually born. It has some key features. One is this slope at the high mass end, which is just called the high mass slope. And this dictates the number of and the masses of massive stars that you will have in a particular environment. And this is the part that we really care about when we talk about metal enrichment or in particular oxygen abundances, because most of our oxygen is coming from core collapse supernovae. So stars which are more massive than 8 to 10 solar masses when they explode. That's where most of our metals are coming from. But these stars are short-lived. So if you go out in a molecular cloud, star cluster, a galaxy, whatever, and you look at the stellar mass, what you're actually seeing is the mass of all of these low mass stars, which can live for a very long time. And that is what we call the low mass end of the IMF or the low mass slope. And depending on which IMF you choose, there's two very well-known IMFs for the solar neighborhood, a Chabrier and a Krupa. Uh, you find something of a turnover or a peak or a breakpoint at some intermediate masses, which is called the characteristic mass, MC over here. So if this characteristic mass is less than a solar mass, we call the IMF as being bottom heavy, which means there are a lot more low mass stars in a particular environment. If this characteristic mass is more than one solar masses, we call the IMF as being top heavy, which means there are a lot more massive stars in a given environment. And depending on whether your IMF is this or that, it can really change the subsequent evolution of your environment. And again, by environment, I mean galaxies or star clusters or molecular clouds. So in the solar neighborhood, you can see MC is less than one solar mass. So the IMF in the solar neighborhood is bottom heavy. However, do we expect this IMF to be universal? If you go back to the second slide that I showed where I talked about the genes mass, it all depends at the end on temperature and density. So if different environments are going to have different evolutions in temperature and density, then fundamental arguments should suggest that the IMF will vary as a function of environment, for example. So again, Gruber 2001, that's one of the main IMF papers. You might have cited it in some of your works if you work on the IMF, or even without, if you do anything with galaxies. And this is the first sentence of that paper. He starts the paper by saying the IMF should vary. However, we don't have concrete evidence yet. The only thing we know is this is how it looks like in the solar neighborhood. That's where it stops, but it should vary. So we do have some evidences for variations in the IMF. There's actually some evidences are stronger, more convincing. Others are probably a little bit weaker. And as a rule of thumb, I always say this in my talks, uh, varying the IMF or finding variations in the IMF is very interesting. However, that should be the last thing that you should do if you are doing anything in terms of observations or theory both. If nothing else can explain the observations or the theory, that's when you start tuning the IMF variations to see whether it actually makes a difference or not. So here's two particular examples. This one is from the Milky Way itself, where as a function of metallicity in the galaxy, so Milky Way has a metallicity gradient, the center is more metal rich than the outskirts. And if you go to very, very low metallicity areas, so you're going very far out from the center of the Milky Way, distances up to 20, 23 kiloparsecs, where initially it was thought that it's quiet in environments, there's not a lot of stars forming there and so on. But now we have detected molecular clouds in young stellar clusters in those regions. And if you then try and do the same IMF exercise that you did in the solar neighborhood, uh, figure out what is the IMF, what is at least the characteristic mass or the turnover mass of the IMF, you see that it's not around 0.2, 0.3 solar masses, which is what you see at solar metallicities. It sort of maybe goes a little bit up. Even within the errors, there is definitely some evidence for variations there. Another example is, let's look at a massive elliptical galaxy. So very, very massive galaxies, usually very quiescent. And if you look at some particular features in the near infrared, so absorption features involving sodium or iron in particular, these features are very sensitive to the ratio of massive stars to low mass stars, basically giants to subgiants, for example. And if you try and explain the observed ratios or the indices with different IMFs, you see that this is the observed, for example, the Virgo and the Coma clusters. This is the one for the Virgo cluster. And depending on which IMF you use, these two lines give you the predicted indices. If you use a Krupa IMF, for example, which is, again, the solar neighborhood IMF, it predicts these indices to be much lower than what observations are finding. The place where observations match these theoretical predictions is whether if you have a very steep slope on the high mass end. So basically, if you have a lot more low mass stars. So this is one of the first papers back in 2010 by Peter and Charlie looking at maybe in the very central regions of massive elliptical galaxies, we might have a larger population of low mass stars, like brown dwarf rich stars, for example. And then there's been a lot of work subsequently on this topic in particular, including from people here at the ISC as well. So a key difference between all of these environments, there is more examples of these environments that I have not shown you here, is their metallicity or the abundance of metals, carbon, oxygen, all of these sort of things. So the question is, can metallicity play a key role in shaping the IMF? And again, there's a lot of theoretic or a lot of observational motivation to look at metallicity dependence of the IMF. Now, again, let's go back to our picture of star formation and look at how stars are forming in molecular clouds, but at different metallicities. So let's do a thought experiment where you take a molecular cloud and you ask, as the density is increasing, basically the cloud is collapsing, what is the response of temperature to the increase in density? Like I said earlier, it's all about temperature and density at the end. Now, in this work, Kazuo Omukai shows, as you increase the density, the response of temperature to the increase in density is very different for different metallicities. So 0 here, it's a log scale metallicity. 0 here is solar metallicity. So this curve here shows you how the temperature will evolve in a molecular cloud in the solar neighborhood. -1 is 1/10 solar, -2 is 100 solar, and -infinity is population 3 stars, or the first stars, which have no metals in them. And you see, even though you start from the same point, just based on the abundance of metals, you can get really, really different temperatures. And this happens because metals or dust, they're very important coolants in the ISM. So if you do not have metals, your gas will not be cooling down. And then that will give you a very different temperature, which will give you a very different Jeans mass. And then that will inherently change the nature of the mass of the stars you're forming in that molecule, in that environment. So at low metallicities, below, -1, -2 on the log scale, stars are forming in dense but warm gas. So often we hear people say stars form in cold gas, 10 Kelvin temperatures of molecular clouds. That is only really true at solar metallicities. Even if you go to the LMC or the SMC, the temperatures are already higher. And this metallicity will significantly impact the star formation process, the IMF, and subsequent metal production. So it's a very vicious cycle. You have some metals, you cool the gas, you form some stars, they will produce more metals, they will cool the gas differently, form another episode of stars, and so on. And this is why it gets very complicated here. So how can we solve, or how can we simplify this problem? Like I said, we have chemistry, we have metals, we have feedback, magnetic fields, turbulence. The one thing that we can remove and still be correct physically and to still correspond to a physically correct system is metals. So let's go to the extreme limit of population 3 star formation, where we have removed all the metals. That's the only thing we can really do to simplify this star formation problem. So what we have been doing is looking at the simulation, looking at the how population 3 or the first stars form in the early universe by doing lots of simulations using a bunch of different codes that run both on CPUs as well as GPUs. In particular, I'll show you results today from Flash, which is a very well-known code in the community. We also are developing a new GPU accelerated code called POCA. It's named after a little Australian marsupial. The idea in these simulations is we start with molecular clouds, things that we think would look like some sort of a molecular cloud, and we let them collapse, and then we follow the increase in density to around 13, 14, even 15 orders of magnitude. If you go back here, for example, molecular clouds are over here, around 1 or 2 on the log x-axis here, but stars are actually forming all the way over here. So they have to overcome 17 to 18 orders of magnitude increase in density. If you look at cosmological simulations, TNG, Eagle, all those sorts of simulations, they are forming stars right here. They cannot resolve beyond densities of 10 to the power 4 or 5 at most. If you look at star formation simulations, we don't really have a simulation that can go beyond 10 to the power 17 or 18 really in densities. It's really, really hard to follow the collapse at the end. The density of stars today, like the sun, for example, is 1 grams per cc, which is all the way right over here. So there's a huge cascade involved in the star formation process, and we try and capture as much of it as possible. Now let's look at all of these other quantities that we really care about, like magnetic fields, feedback, one by one. So what I'm going to show you first is a simulation, which is what we call a chemo-hydrodynamic simulation. So it's basically hydrodynamics with chemistry included in the simulation. So you're doing on-the-fly live chemistry. And the 3 panels here will show you the density projections in the 3 different axes. So 3D simulation. So you see how the density increases in a collapsing molecular cloud. You will see some stars will form. And let's see how it looks like. Oops. So as soon as you have one star forming, there is a lot of fragmentation, and we have multiple stars or sync particles, which are the proxies for stars in the simulation that form. So in these environments, no metals, chemistry plus hydrodynamics, within the first few thousand years of the first star forming in these clouds, we quickly form a few more stars. We form around 7 to 10 stars. Now, let's see what happens if you keep the simulation exactly the same and you introduce magnetic fields. And I can go into the details later of how do we actually implement magnetic fields in these simulations. So now what you will notice is that there is one star that forms. It becomes fairly massive. Magnetic fields provide a lot of support against gravity, so it does not let the cloud fragment any further. And even after twice the time as in the previous simulation, there's only one star that forms. It has a very nice accretion disk around it. You can see in the three projections over here. It's fairly massive, around 50, 60 solar masses. We can follow the simulation for later as well. I've just not done that in for this particular thing here. So basically what you're seeing here is that magnetic fields are really suppressing the formation of lots of population 3 stars. And the stars that can actually form become more massive than they otherwise would have if there were no magnetic fields present. Now, let's look at what happens when you have radiation feedback. So these young stars, once they are formed, they will produce a lot of ionizing photons, which will ionize the gas around them. Again, change the distribution of temperature and density. And let's see what happens here. So the first movie, again, is just chemistry plus hydrodynamics. It's not the same as the last one because this is still work in progress. So it's not at that resolution that we would want to achieve in the final runs. And if I play this movie here, you'll see we have one star forming. It has a very nice accretion disk around it. It also has this larger halo. And this is happening because of turbulence and when you can resolve shocks and so on. But that's a separate point, not really important for this talk. You see that even in like 6,000 years, the star has reached a mass of 50 solar masses. It's still accreting. All of the gas that is around this star is getting accreted onto this star. It's not collapsing by itself to give you more stars. This will continue for a while. Uh, so even in 10,000 years, we don't really form another star. Now, if we include radiation, and again, how we include radiation, like the numerical treatment of it, I can go into details later. Um, in the exact same simulation, what happens is there is a very compact H2 region that starts evolving around this massive star. It makes the disk very lopsided. You can see the star is not at the center of the disk at all times. The disk has these spirally features, which then start collapsing to give rise to more stars. And then very quickly, you again have a system of around 4 to 5 stars. So what's happening here? As soon as you turn on radiation feedback from these protostars, they will heat the gas, which means the gene's mass has gone up. So now this gas is not going to accrete onto this existing star because it's too hot. So the only option available for this gas or a portion of this gas is to collapse by itself and form another star. And this is what we believe gives rise to the characteristic mass of the IMF, even in the solar neighborhood. If you did not have radiation feedback, you would have a lot more brown dwarfs even in the solar neighborhood than you have today. It's because of radiation feedback allowing the formation of a more number of stars and not just sort of inhibiting the formation of more stars at the end. That sort of drives this picture. You can see this is a huge, sort of still like a disky structure, lots of spirally waves over here, a lot of ionizing photons. 10 to the power 49 per second is just a lot of ionizing photons in general. So this really changes the temperature structure of the gas again. Now, let's look at what happens if we include all of these things together. So we have radiation, we have chemistry, we have magnetic fields. Now, this is a very, very expensive simulation to run. And this is right now the only simulation of star formation, not even POP3 star formation, but in general in star formation that resolves down to AU scales where we do have all the physics, but these are very, very expensive simulations to run. And they require a lot of background work, particularly a lot by Shyam Menon, who is CCA fellow at Flatiron Institute in New York. So in here, the picture is somewhere between the two regimes that we have seen before, where we do have one star that forms because of radiation feedback. We will soon see some fragmentation. There is a very nice disk-like structure again over here. So There you go. So now we do have 2 stars. Maybe we'll have 3 or 4 stars at the end in total, but not as many as what just radiation feedback would give you. So magnetic fields try and inhibit fragmentation, so they give you less number of stars, more massive. Radiation feedback sort of works both ways. It gives you more stars, but then it also makes the stars sort of slightly more massive or slightly less massive. And then if you include all of these things together, you end up in a situation that's between these two regimes. Now, this has not really been seen before because we haven't had a simulation that has included both magnetic fields and radiation feedback, in particular for POP3 stars. But the one thing that I haven't told you is that we need a lot of statistics here. You cannot run one of these simulations, even though they are very expensive, and conclude anything about the mass distribution or the IMF. You need a lot of these simulations to run together to actually statistically look at or arrive at results which you can convince people with. This is one such example. As a function of the number of simulations, you can see how different the mass distribution in simulations are between uh, my hydrodynamic and MHD simulation. So there is no feedback or radiation here, but just magnetic fields. If you only do 1 or 10 of these simulations, you might not see a difference. So you might conclude that magnetic fields do not really matter for population 3-star formation. It's only when you start doing a lot more of these, you start to see what's the real picture, because you start overcoming the stochasticity due to turbulence. So turbulence is a very evil player in this entire game here. And it's true for star formation even in the Milky Way or at low metallicities. As soon as you have turbulence, it makes the system very stochastic. So to achieve any particular mass distribution, you have to then do a lot of these simulations. So this is what the very, very basic picture is emerging. If you take your POP1 IMF, POP1 stars meaning, let's say, the Milky Way or the IMF in the solar neighborhood, and you take what we are finding so far about the population 3 IMF. So you're going all the way from solar metallicities to zero metallicities. You will notice I have deliberately hidden the numbers on the axes here because this is still not clear, not confirmed. This is a very preliminary idea that we are seeing from these simulations. What happens in population 1? If you only have chemistry or hydrodynamics, you would get the black line for the IMF. So you would have a lot more brown dwarfs, and you would also have a lot more massive stars. The most important effect of magnetic fields in population 1 is protostellar outflows. So these massive stars have outflows, and we can actually see them in galaxies around us or even in the Milky Way. So they help inhibit the mass growth of these massive stars. So they make sure you don't end up with a lot of more massive stars uh, in galaxies like the Milky Way. Radiation feedback has two important effects. One is it sort of shifts the peak to somewhere like 0.2, 0.3 solar masses. Again, it's feedback from young stars, then sort of pushes the gas around it farther away. So the gas cannot accrete onto these stars and has to fragment by itself. Another impact of radiation feedback is also on the massive star side. These massive stars have very, very big H2 regions or ionized regions of gas around them. And that gas then cannot accrete onto these stars anymore. So radiation feedback halts the growth of these very, very massive stars. And this has been very well studied. That's why I haven't given you any references here. Uh, Now, for population 3, what we are finding is, first of all, we do find a lot more massive stars than what you would in the Milky Way or in the solar neighborhood. If you only have chemistry and hydrodynamics, this is sort of the shape that you might get. The impact of magnetic fields is it suppresses the formation of low mass population 3 stars, sort of shifts the peak to more massive stars. And the impact of radiation feedback is the same as what you have in present day star formation, where it halts accretion onto very, very massive stars. So this is something that we are sort of, I think, converging towards in our simulations, but we still have to do a lot more of these simulations to be very clear. Now, if you only take these two endpoints, it already sort of maybe tells you that there is a variation in the IMF with metallicity. And again, like I said, even Krupa already predicted that. People have been thinking about this for a very, very long time. This is the scale in metallicity we have. Let's say we go from 0 all the way to supersolar metallicities. Now let's fill in what we know about uh, the IMFs as a function of metallicity just from this talk. We know in the solar neighborhood, which is solar, the IMF is bottom heavy. This is what it looks like. And the IMF looks like it is going to be top heavy in population 3 environments at 0 metallicities. And there is a lot of evidence around it. It's all sort of circumstantial a little bit because we haven't directly seen any of these top 3 stars. We haven't directly produced an IMF from first principles that includes all the physics in our simulations yet. But this is the picture that is emerging. There are lots of interesting systems in between. We have a lot of metal poor stars, which people here in the audience also work on. We have ultra compact dwarf galaxies. We have globular clusters. We have like LMC, SMC type galaxies. And we also have very, very massive elliptical galaxies that are super solar. So the question is there some sort of a transition in the IMF from across metallicities along all of these scales? Or if this is top heavy and this is bottom heavy, has the IMF evolved from being top to bottom heavy as a function of metallicity? So when did the IMF become bottom heavy as a function of metallicity? Let's see what the star formation picture says. Again, if you distill the arguments that you're finding from all of these simulations, ours as well as other people's, you can create intuitive models that tell you what should be the peak mass or the characteristic mass of the IMF as a function of metallicity. And this is what it looks like. So of course, it depends not only on the metallicity, but on a lot of different things, including density, pressure, all sorts of things you care about in ISM physics. In a low pressure ISM, so this is an ISM that is typical of galaxies like the Milky Way. We are not super starbursty, we're not starbursty at all. We are just a normal, almost main sequence galaxy forming stars in low pressure ISMs. As a function of metallicity again, so this is solar here, this is almost primordial population 3 like. This is the characteristic mass. And we see there is some expected evolution of the IMF or the characteristic mass of the IMF as a function of metallicity just from these ISM physics arguments, where it's sort of very, very top heavy at very, very low metallicities and evolves down to being bottom heavy at higher metallicities. Very interestingly, around solar metallicity is where the variations in the IMF almost go down, go to 0, basically, in this particular picture. All of these different lines correspond to different other ISM parameters like density, turbulence, and all. But the main focus here is on the metallicity. So this is what metals are doing in molecular clouds. And it looks like the IMF probably became bottom heavy somewhere between this range in metallicity. It's a huge range in metallicity, but this is the best we can do so far. Let's now look at a very, very high pressure ISM. So compact, very dense clouds that we believed existed in the cores of massive elliptical galaxies when they were forming stars. They were undergoing vibrant, violent periods of star formation. They had very, very strong star formation bursts and then became quiescent very quickly as well. So in these ISMs, again, the graph is the same, the y and the x-axis. The main thing to notice here is that at super high metallicity, so super solar metallicities, these models are predicting an IMF that is bottom heavy, but it is more bottom heavy than the IMF in the Milky Way. So if you see this difference that I've marked with these 2 lines over here, at super solar metallicities, they are sort of a factor of 3 different. So basically, these models are saying that the IMF could be more bottom heavy in the centers of these massive elliptical galaxies, which is what a lot of people who work on massive elliptical galaxies are finding as well through observations. But again, these are models, and ultimately, we do need to do simulations across the whole range of metallicities because this is such a nonlinear, complex system. But it's good to have a first idea of what this looks like. And this is very interesting right now in the James Webb era because we have lots of observing programs with James Webb trying to measure the IMF in different environments or looking at population 3 stars. There's a lot of excitement now again with people finding more and more galaxies at higher redshifts, maybe looking at signs of population 3 stars or star clusters, but also even in our own backyard, there are programs to look at stellar populations in metal poor galaxies near the Milky Way as well, and try and actually constrain the entire IMF. So when I say the entire IMF, I mean all the way down to subsolar masses. Now, I started by saying we care about galaxies, we care about metals in galaxies. Metals are being produced through stars. We understand the IMF. Why is the IMF so important in particular for us who study metallicities? Is because that is what is setting the distribution of metals. This ISM physics sets the distribution and location of the birth sites of where metals are being produced. And what we actually see in galaxies is this large scale distribution of metals. So that is our observable. It's one of our very, very important observables in galaxy evolution. So try and connect the two. And we cannot do this yet in simulations. We cannot go from very resolved molecular cloud scales to galactic scales, although there has been one such attempt in the last month. So what do we know about metallicities in galaxies? We know that galaxies have a mass-metallicity relation, where as a function of the stellar mass in galaxies, low-mass galaxies have low metals. So for those of you not aware of this nomenclature, 12 plus log over H is the oxygen abundance in the gas. Like I said, we care a lot about oxygen abundance in the gas. That's our standard metallicity measurement. At higher masses, more massive galaxies have more metals in them. There's a lot of discrepancies here based on how you actually calibrate your models or your diagnostics that give you a metallicity output for a galaxy. But this is the basic picture. And a lot of work has been done in the last so many years trying to understand what drives this relation. It's one of the most important scaling relations we have in galaxy evolution. And we are also starting to explore this at higher shifts. But you would notice that I call this the global metallicity. So this is one value of metallicity for the entire galaxy. So an integrated measurement. But of course, now we have IFUs, where instead of just getting one integrated light measurement per galaxy, we can place all of these different fibers or IFUs on different parts of the galaxy, get a spectrum from each of these parts, and then use that to get a metallicity estimate for each of these things. So we are now getting a lot of measurements of spatially resolved metallicities. This has really been driven quite far in the last decade or so by major local surveys like SAMI, Manga, and Khalifa, which I know people here are also involved in. Here is such an example of a map. This is actually from Muse, where what you're seeing in this map is all of the colored dots are H2 regions, regions of ionized gas, where we can measure the emission lines of different elements, and then we can convert them to an oxygen abundance. So the color bar shows that oxygen abundance, and you see as you go from the center to the outskirts, there is a gradient in metallicity. And to first order, just do a very simple linear fit to this gradient, you get a slope, and this slope is called the metallicity gradient. So now we are moving into this era of spatially resolved metallicities or radially resolved metallicities, measuring the metallicity gradients and so on. And then this brings the question of how do we model them? So since the 1960s almost, we have had a lot of work focusing on chemical evolution of galaxies, where we started from very simple closed box and open box models. So what this means is you just say, this is the amount of star formation, this is the amount of metals produced, all good. In the open box, you also include processes that bring gas to the galaxy or remove gas from the galaxy. So accretion of gas onto galactic disks, outflows as well. And in early 2000s to 2010s, we had this picture developing where chemical evolution models were modeling galaxies as like a two-component reservoir. For example, you have gas in the blue, stars in the red. The entire idea is you have gas accretion happening onto the galaxies. They will trigger star formation. Star formation will produce metals. And then these metals will again be returned to the ISM of the galaxy. And this is what you measure. And during this entire process, you also have winds. Now, this picture or these models do reasonably well at explaining mass metallicity relations or global metallicity relations. There's still lots of things we need to think about more in there, but they get the basic picture right. Now, we want to talk about metallicity gradients or spatially resolved metallicities. And there, again, we need to understand our ISM physics a lot more in detail. So what I've done is basically taken this picture and made it more complicated. You don't have to go into the details of it. This is just to show that ISM physics starts to matter a lot more for resolved metallicity distributions. And this is expected, but has not been modeled so far. So what are the main things that you need when you try and model metallicity gradients or resolve metallicities? Typically, what we do, we solve for what we call the mass balance. We say accretion of gas equals star formation plus outflows. That's it, very simple. We also say metallicity of accreted gas times the metallicity of star formation, metallicity of outflows. That's the metal balance. But for resolved metallicities, we also need to start taking into account what we call energy balance in the ISM. So star formation or accretion or outflows, they're not only adding or removing metals from the galaxy, they are also adding or removing energy. And this energy is very important because this will redistribute metals. So imagine if you have a very energetic event like a supernovae, it has produced metals, yes. The metals are not going to stay there. They're going to move around and mix. So getting the idea of that mixing requires understanding that energy balance in the ISM. And that is the novel component of these sort of new generation of models of chemical evolution. And because you can include energy balance, you can then also include major modes of metal transport. So this is again like a hydrodynamic fluid dynamics problem now, where you have a lot of turbulence, you have a lot of gas, and that's moving metals around with it. You have to take that into account in your modeling. And particularly, these models include what we call differential enrichment of outflows. So what that means is that the metallicity of the winds from a galaxy may not be the same as the metallicity of the ISM in the galaxy. That's just what it means. We have thought about this for a long time as well, but it's very, very hard to get direct evidence for a process like this, for a differential enrichment. So basically, winds are removing a lot more metals from the ISM than otherwise you would think is normal. So you have all of these components in a chemical evolution model. You can explain or reproduce the global relations, which I'm not talking about in this talk. I'll focus more on the resolved relations. So for example, the mass metallicity gradient relation. So this is just like the mass metallicity relation, but now we plot it as a function of metallicity gradients. And this has been produced again from a few different surveys, including Khalifa, where I know people here have also worked extensively. But we don't really understand the origin of this. There's a lot of scatter as well. There is some basic trend that we see that people agree on, but there's a lot more work to be done here. Now, I'll first show what the predictions from these models are. So again, the x-axis is the stellar mass. The y-axis is the metallicity gradient. We measure it in dex over the effective scale of the galaxy. And you don't have to look at the color bar too much. It's just the ratio of two of these ISM processes that we think are important for setting metallicity gradients in galaxies. There's more processes than two. We just show two here. What's important is that at a fixed stellar mass, there is a big scatter even in the models. The models have no like fixed tunable parameters. They're all constrained by the evolution of gas and stars and galaxies. The only free parameter really is this, the metallicity of the winds, because we just have no idea what winds are really doing. So if real galaxies lie at the bottom of these color bars, it means the wind metallicity is the same as the ISM. That's like a lower bound. Implies perfect mixing before metals are ejected out of the ISM. If galaxies lie over here, what's the top? The models say that likely means there are a lot of metal enriched winds in these galaxies. So just from the model, you can see at the low mass end, there is a big scatter. At the very, very massive end, there is not much. So winds do not seem to be very critical in explaining metallicity gradients in very massive galaxies. And this is where the data lies. So we have 3 IFU surveys, Manga, Khalifa, Sami. So overall, we are looking at a few 10,000 galaxies almost. So each of these points is like an average of few hundred galaxies in a particular stellar mass band. So orange are the 3 surveys, gray is the mean or the average of all of these 3 surveys taken together. There's a lot more things happening here, but the key takeaway point from this is all of these low mass galaxies, galaxies below 10 to the power 9.5, let's say, prefer to lie in a parameter space where the models are saying they should preferentially be losing metals through galactic winds. This is not a fit to the data. This is just putting the data on top of the models. And this is the main conclusion that we are deriving from this. Has this been seen before? Yes. Even to explain the mass metallicity relation, people have thought about metal enriched winds from dwarf galaxies becoming a very important thing. And there's some physical arguments for why that could be the case. Why can dwarf galaxies lose a lot of their metals? And we also see this now directly in simulations. But have we actually measured, have we gone out and measured the metallicities in galactic winds in galaxies around us, even in the local universe? It's a very tricky measurement. Winds are multi-phase, which means to get any idea of metallicity, you do have to cover all the different phases of the winds. The emission is very, very faint. It takes a lot of time to do this analysis. But there's like 6 or 7 galaxies where this has been possible, where we have done direct measurements of metallicities in galactic winds. And these are still lower limits on the metallicity of the wind because they're only looking at one phase of the CGM. These are the points, the pink coming from John Chisholm's work and the one yellow coming from Grace Telford's work. And you do see that as a function of this wind metallicity parameter, low mass galaxies tend to show a little bit of a decline, which means they are sort of preferring, or they are sort of implying that the wind metallicities are higher than the ISM metallicities in these galaxies. If you look at the actual numbers over here, for these galaxies, the wind metallicities are twice or thrice their ISM metallicity, which means the winds are very metal enriched in these galaxies. But we do need a lot more observations to really drive this point home further. Now, I focused a lot on energy balance, which intuitively to us reflects in the turbulence in the ISM. So one additional thing we can do with these models, which has not been done before, is look at the correlation between gas kinematics and metallicities. Intuitively, you would expect there to be some correlation because depending on how turbulent the galaxy is, what is the gas dispersion or the rotational velocity, you would expect them to move metals around, redistribute metals, and so on. But it's a very nonlinear relationship. So can we actually now quantify this relationship through models as well as observations? So in this plot, what I'm showing is the gas velocity dispersion as a function of the metallicity gradients. And the 3 lines here correspond to 3 models. And these are sort of the steepest metallicity gradients the model can produce. So the more negative the gradient, the more steep it is. 0 is flat, basically no gradient. You have same metallicity throughout the disk. And from the very, very few galaxies, again, where we can measure both of these quantities, we can measure a gradient. We can also measure kinematics. This is what the picture emerges. So these are a handful of galaxies, actually not at redshift 0, at redshift 1 to 3, where we have reliable measurements of the gas dispersion and the gradients. I would not trust anything that is below 20 kilometers per second here, really. You're reaching below the instrumental resolution. So this is observations with Muse and Symphony, particularly. What we see as a function of the rotational velocity, which is a proxy for the stellar mass. So galaxies with very, very high rotational velocities are typically very, very massive. Is at the high velocity dispersion end, there is a lot of efficient mixing of metals. You can imagine, right? There's a lot of turbulence. It's going to mix metals around quite a lot. And then that starts driving a very flat metallicity gradient, this side over here, in the models. In the case of the low velocity dispersion, what happens in the model is efficient dilution of metals. So you're diluting the metallicity throughout, and then that's bringing the metallicity gradient down. Can these observations convince us that that's really happening in real life? We are not sure yet. I'm not convinced myself. Because again, we are below the instrumental limit of these. So any velocity dispersion measurement below 20 is probably not very believable. But this is where we need a lot more observations. We can't do this in observations very well yet, but we can do this in simulations, right? So let's look at what simulations look like. So if you take TNG50, and there are some reasons for why I'm taking TNG50 and all other simulations here. And you look at the gradients on the y-axis, again, as a function of v over sigma. So rotational velocity over the dispersion. That is sort of a measure of how disky your galaxy is, how rotationally supported your galaxy is. For example, for the Milky Way, V5 of 220 kilometers per second, our gas dispersion is around 10, 15 kilometers per second. So our V over sigma is more than 10. So massive galaxies or rotationally supported galaxies usually lie. If it's less than one, then these are usually very perturbed galaxies. They don't have a disk-like morphology at all. They are usually maybe like merging systems as well, so on. And this is the parameter space of the model in the colored area. All the white points are the data that we have currently. And this is what it looks like at the same redshift from all of the TNG50 galaxies. So same axes over here. This is log. This wasn't log. It's a bit different. This is a 2D histogram. So each of these point is a collection of few galaxies in TNG50 where they have measured the gradient and the VO sigma. There's more than 1,000 galaxies in total. This magenta line is the same as this dashed black line in the moon. So both the models and the simulations are finding that most galaxies should lie within these magenta lines, or within this magenta line or this black dash line, filling in this parameter space. There's very, very few galaxies that are outside this parameter space. And these are galaxies where either the gradient is maybe a transient feature, it's not a gradient that has been established for a long time. Maybe there is some non-equilibrium scenario that's occurring in these galaxies, but they are not majority of the galaxies. Most galaxies do seem to show this correlation between their kinematics and their metallicities. This is one another interesting way to sort of look at galaxy assembly in general and see what are the metallicities of these very perturbed galaxy systems and what are their kinematics, because that gives us a third dimension to constrain our chemical evolution models. That tells us a bit about the balance of energy in these galaxies. And of course, again, with James Webb, we are finding a lot of emission lines, even at very, very high redshifts. We do not have good calibrations yet to actually convert them to metallicities, but once we do, it will be very interesting to look at very, very high redshift galaxies as well. We are already seeing galaxies that maybe already have metallicities near 1/10 or half solar, for example. But the jury is still out on what is their real metallicity content and their kinematics and so on. So we can really understand these very high redshift galaxies, like galaxies beyond redshift 5 or 6, from a metallicity point of view. Here's just one such example of a lensed galaxy at redshift 3 from James Webb, where because of the lensing magnification, you do have better resolution to reach almost the level of H2 regions, not quite there yet. And then look at the distribution of metals as a function of the radius of the galaxy. Sometimes you see weird features like a gradient that is inverted. So centers are more metal poor as compared to the outskirts. And then there's a whole thing on whether you believe them. And if you do, what sets an inverted gradient? That's a whole other topic I'm not touching in this talk. But chemical evolution is not subject to which galaxy you apply it to. If your models are complete, you can always come back to galaxies we know the best, like the Milky Way. Also start looking at what the models are predicting about the time evolution of metallicity gradients in a Milky Way-like galaxy. So this is redshift over here. Again, the gradient on the y-axis. These yellow points are observations. We have a lot better observations than these. We don't do this in the Milky Way anymore. We don't do 1D gradients because we have a nice 2D footprint, actually a 3D footprint from surveys like SDSS, Apogee and Gaia and so on. So we don't do this anymore. We only do this for external galaxies. This is just for us to see what the models would say about Milky Way-like galaxies. And the models are these red points over here, basically saying a mild evolution in the gradient, where the gradients were flatter in the past and are steeper now, which is also what simulations are finding. But the degree of flatness or steepness is quite uncertain even now. What we can actually do better is use this 3D footprint of stars where we know as a function of where they are in the galaxy, both in R and Z. We know their metallicities, we know their proper motions, positions, velocities, everything. And this is a very statistically significant data set with Gaia in particular coming in there as well. And we can then decompose this map into two parts. One which talks about radial migration of stars, and the other that talks about chemical evolution of the gas. And this is a much better way to apply these chemical evolution models because there is so much more information that can come out of the Milky Way. All right, so I think I will end here. I just wanted to show a very different slide. I don't know if there are any master's undergrad students in the room. Maybe not. But if you're supervising any master's undergrad students, please let them know about the summer research program in astrophysics that we have at the Leiden Observatory with European Space Agency, ESTEC. It will run for 10 weeks from June to August next year. We'll have some projects. It's fully funded. And usually the students who come into this program, this is done every year, have a very, very good time. We have a lot of applicants from University of La Laguna every year. So just if you can advertise this, and if you have any questions about this program, please send me an email or come talk to me. All right, so I can just conclude there. I've talked a lot about metals, both from a star formation IMF point of view, but also from a galaxy point of view. And they might seem a bit disjoint, but ultimately what we want to do is to study the first galaxies in the universe. Understanding them requires we understand our star formation process in the early universe very well, but we also understand our physics of metals and metal distribution galaxies because that's what we will actually see in the future. So connecting the two is very important. I've talked about star formation at zero and low metallicities, how magnetic fields and radiation feedback play important roles there, but the roles are very different than what you would see at solar metallicities. So this was not expected before. On large scales, I've talked a lot about metal distribution galaxies, metallicity gradients in particular, and the connection with galactic winds and galaxy kinematics, and how the next frontier in galaxy evolution requires us to really probe the CGM as well as we can and understand how this entire baronic cycle works. So I can stop there. So thank you very much for your attention. I can take questions.
Okay, thank you very much for this very nice talk. Are there questions?
Great talk. Really enjoy it. And very clarifying the different aspects that are contributing to change this IMF variations. And I also like it, the fact that you, in the conclusions, you showing some of the key pictures, the big plots, no?
Yeah.
My question goes, in fact, about the second one, okay, with this evolution with metallicity, which is more or less the time evolution as well. And this is not, a new result, what you're showing here, because this comes, I remember, from for example, work from Ferrara in Trieste, maybe more than 20 years ago, okay? And you got more or less the same picture. And the transition is, I think it's -5, right?
Somewhere around between -2 to -4.
Exactly.
Yeah. But
yeah. Well, I remember from these old works, it was around in between -4 and -6. But in your case, well, it's in fact is really sharp. The evolution there in that regime, and you explain that this is magnetic fields may play a role here and so on. So, but the numbers are not particularly, let's say, very different from what has been found before, no? Probably something very well settled. I would say. So the question is that now in this region that goes, let's say, below -3, we got a lot of observations now in the Milky Way, because you talk about the difference in the different places, let's say, in the galaxy. For example, in the elliptical galaxies is in the center where you get this bottom heavy feature. Do you think this is possible to make the counts in a way that that can show this picture from purely observations? I mean, or is there any effort in that direction that
Yeah.
show that? Yeah, this is my
Yeah.
first question. The second question is,
Right.
you talked about the total metallicity, but for example, these very metal poor stars, some of them are well known to be carbon,
Enhanced, yeah.
super enhanced, no?
Yeah.
In that sense. So in which way, or if you have any consideration on how this would affect these results, and particularly this dropping down on the slope?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, those are very good questions. So for the first one, this is something that is being attempted as we speak now, where there are people who are looking at, so people are looking at the outer Milky Way a lot, so beyond 16, 17 kiloparsecs. And the motivation there actually doesn't come from star formation or galaxies at all. It comes from planet formation, because they want to understand what is the habitable zone for exoplanets within our own galaxy. Does it extend all the way down to those environments? And they're finding a very, very rich chemistry over there. You have lots of big molecules as well, and so on. And there are young stellar clusters in those regions where now we can sort of derive an IMF out based on counting stars individually. Of course, there is this caveat of how do you convert? You have to use some protostellar isochrones to get a stellar mass out for these young stars, but you can do that. And people have done that as a function of metallicity. So if I, but it's, yeah, let me go back to. Yep. So this is actually one of those words that I'm talking about, where the metallicity is almost, I don't know. So solar is 0.014, this is 0.002. So definitely like almost reaching 110 solar. All of these are young star clusters in the Milky Way. So these two axes are exactly the same as what I had in my second plot on my summary, but we cannot go beyond, like few percent solar still. So the major variations in the IMF are happening below 1% solar. Yeah, and that's where that is sort of still not within our reach. Although there is a JWST program to look at LEO P, I think, which is 3% solar. But maybe, yeah, getting from an observational point of view, it seems really tricky to go and measure an IMF below that metallicity level. But at least in this metallicity range, we can already constrain our models very, very well with this. And this has not been done before because we just didn't expect anything to find at that radii in the Milky Way. And if you went to the SMC or the LMC, we cannot count the stars there, even in the brightest regions. They're just too crowded for us. For the second point, so yeah, there are like a lot of metal poor stars. Many of them are carbon enhanced. I mean, you have worked a lot on this, so you know more than I do. But from a star formation point of view, what really matters is the abundance of oxygen and carbon, not iron. So given a ratio or the abundance of carbon and oxygen, these models can already sort of predict what would be the variations in the transition in the IMF. And this was something that I did earlier this year with Anisha Marcy and other people who look a lot at metal poor stars. We go to the, yeah. Where so these are our measurements. The magenta points are the carbon to oxygen ratio from metal poor stars. These are 3D NLT abundances. And the green points are from metal poor H2 regions in galaxies in the local universe. This program led by Daniel Berg's HST observations. And you can see that carbon is much less for at least for these stars as compared to oxygen. It's not solar scaled. And then that reflects in the IMF or in the transition in the IMF. particularly in the low pressure ISM case, you can see how much carbon you have in the ISM will give you a factor of 7 difference at most in your IMF calculations. So this would impact again the amount of stars and the masses of stars you're forming and so on. Yeah, so this is going to be very critical. What is more critical is getting measurements of oxygen in stars below OH of -2.5. So we have stars with Fe/H of -3, -4, -5. We don't have the oxygen measurements in these. It's very tricky to measure oxygen. So as an ISM person, that's what I need a lot more than iron. But hopefully in the future, if we get those, we can keep extending this to lower metallicity.
Yeah, very quickly. Well, thank you. Thank you. As usual, it's a great talk. My question is, in your simulations, when accounting for feedback at magnetic fields, well, I'm conscious they are super expensive and that you have lower statistics, but any idea or any feeling about how narrow is the distribution of masses for first stars? And if any room for zero metallicity, low mass star formation?
Those are very good questions. From what we are finding, once you do include both magnetic fields and radiation feedback, so basically these are the two key components that have not been included together in a simulation like this. We do find the range of the mass distribution to be more narrower. With magnetic fields, it's very hard to get low mass stars. So anything below 0.8 solar masses, which you think might survive for a Hubble time. There are some, but like 1 or 2, and it really depends on the dynamics of the cluster. These stars somehow have to be ejected very early on from the system to end body dynamics. And this happens in some simulations, but it's very, very rare that we see those. So magnetic fields are then pushing that to higher masses. And radiation feedback is trying to make sure the stars don't become too massive. So as soon as you reach a stellar mass of 90, 100, 130, 140 solar masses at most, feedback from these stars is so strong. Again, that feedback is dependent on our stellar evolution understanding. But it is very strong to effectively halt accretion gas. They cannot grow further. So then the mass range seems to be something between 1 to 3 solar masses to something like 100 to 120, so on. But the exciting part for me is we finally will have, and these numbers have always been thrown about, right? These are not new numbers, but quantifying how exactly it would look like, this is where we are approaching towards.